Jared Spool is the founder of User Interface Engineering, the largest usability research organization of its kind in the world. If you've ever seen Jared speak about usability, you know that he's probably the most effective and knowledgeable communicator on the subject today. He's been working in the field of usability and design since 1978, before the term usability was ever associated with computers. Please join me in welcoming Jared Spool.
Good morning. Good morning. It's the last day of summer. Or tomorrow? Tomorrow is, right? Yeah? Tomorrow? Yeah? Though we're right in the middle of pumpkin spice season, so. That's right. Hi, I'm internet sensation and teen heartthrob Jared Spool. And putting on an event like this takes a tremendous amount of effort, and I know the team has been working on this for quite a long time, more than a year. And let's make some noise for these folks. They volunteered and put hard time making this happen. So I want to tell you a story about a designer in Australia named Luke Stevens, who did what many designers look forward to doing. He signed his first book deal. And like many designers who sign their first book deal, he was ready to roll up his sleeves, sit down, buckle in, and do what you're supposed to do when you work on your first book: completely distract yourself by redesigning your personal website. And he decided for his personal website, he was actually going to tie it into the theme of the book he hasn't written yet. And what he was going to do was make two versions of his homepage so that he could actually get data, because the book itself was about designing with data. And so he came up with one version which described what the book would look like, what it would have in it, what the topics were. And if you were interested, you could fill out the little box there and put in your email address, and he would collect and see how many email addresses he got from this version. But he also thought he'd try a completely different version, a version where it just says, "Are you a designer?" And would mention that there's a book, but not really talk about what's going to be in the book, but still ask you for an email address. And his hypothesis was that with these two versions of his site, that the site that described the book would collect more email addresses from people who are interested in that book than the one that was more vague. And he could use this in his book to talk about how you make decisions with data. But after he had this up for a while, and he had about 600 people visit both versions of his site, he looked at how many email addresses he collected, and he noticed that for the one that described the book, he collected 33 email addresses. And for the version that didn't describe the book, he collected 77 email addresses. So he blogged about this. He said, "Oh my gosh, this was a win, right? I expected something based on my intuition, but the data told me different. And this is why it's important we collect data and design differently. That the second version collected more email addresses, and that was the version that I should put up as my main personal website." Now, there are a couple of statements in there that are really interesting. If we take them apart, he's basically saying that the more email addresses he collects, the better it is. Now, he's also saying that all email addresses are equal, that just getting an email address was important. Here's the thing. He doesn't know about the quality of the email addresses, right? He doesn't know whether those email addresses will translate into what he eventually wanted, which was people to buy the book. And we don't know whether the 77 people who put in email addresses. We're excited about that. The 77 people who put in email addresses on the second variant were as likely to buy the book as the first ones. The first ones knew about the book. One could infer that the first variant would actually be more likely to get book sales than the second variant. But here's the problem. We'll never know. He never wrote the book. So, we don't really know how his experiment turned out, but we can still learn from it. All those email addresses were based on these two beliefs that Luke had. And we can call the email addresses observations. We didn't actually see people typing them in, but we could see the database get populated with these, and they were legitimate emails, or at least legitimate looking emails. So we can pretty much observe that people are entering their email address here. That's a safe observation. But this idea that more email addresses are better and that all email addresses are equal, those beliefs, they're not the same as an observation. They're an inference. And this idea of observation and inference, this is actually really important when we're talking about creating websites or applications or anything that we're building, because it's from these things that we end up making design decisions. We see something in the world which causes us to infer why that might be happening. And based on that inference, we decide, okay, we're going to put up the second version. That's the outcome that we want. And that's, in fact, a framework that we can use. We can say, okay, we got more email addresses from the second variant, and we have this inference that more email addresses are better, so therefore, we use the second variant. We can make this a little bit more abstract and say, okay, really what observations are what did we see? Inferences are why do we think that happened? And the design decisions are how will we improve the design of what we're building? Observation, inference, design, decision. This is the website of Wells Fargo that they launched in 1999, and this was a significant website change for them. The previous version of this website was basically a speckled gray background informational site about the bank. This was the first site where you could actually conduct transactions. It was the first site where they were going to have up-to-date information about rates and policies, all sorts of things. And this was a big change for them. And they'd worked on this for more than a year. More importantly, they were the first bank to do this. So everyone was watching what they were doing with their website. And for the first time, they were going to collect data about their users, what they did when they came to the site, and they were going to look at that data. And one of the first projects they looked at involved search. Up at the top is what we would now see as a search box. But back in 1999, that was a design pattern that a lot of people weren't familiar with. The previous version of this website, and almost every other website on the web, would have a link that said search. You would click that link, it would bring you to a form page where you would type in what you wanted, and then it would produce results. Putting a search box on the home page, this was really one of the first instances that anybody had ever done that. Way back in 1999. And so they wanted to know, what do people search for when they come to this? And so they went into their data files, into the log files, and they started to look. And they were completely surprised. Their hypothesis was that the most searched for things would be things like ATM locations, or what the current money market rates are, or how to apply for a mortgage. But it wasn't any of those things. The most popular thing searched for was actually nothing. The log file was filled with blanks. People were searching for nothing. And they couldn't figure out why. The team quickly came to a bunch of guesses. One group thought that this was really the first time they ever had this pattern up in the upper left of the login, and that this idea of using the home page to log in, maybe the code was broken. Maybe somehow when you hit enter or you pressed that button, it accidentally triggered search and not login. And if the search box was empty, that would create this false log entry. So there was a big theory that that button was broken. There was another group of people amongst the team who thought that the real problem was that people weren't entering search. After all, we never had this structure where you type in your search query and then press search. You would always do it the other way around. You'd hit search, go to the page where you type in your query, and so it was reversed from what people were used to. So there was a theory that people didn't realize that that box that was next to the search button was actually a place to type something in. It doesn't actually look like a field by any standard definition of a field. There was a small contingent on the team who were completely ecstatic because they thought that the blank entries proved that they were right, that people needed advanced search, and that that's how they thought they would get it. So they felt completely vindicated by this, and were saying, no, that's the problem. It's definitely the advanced search thing. And then there were another small group on the team, a couple of developers, who their first thought was the logging software was broken. That in fact people were typing stuff in, but somehow it just wasn't being recorded properly in the log. That could happen. So the question became, what was causing this problem? Now if we use our little framework, we can say, okay, the observation is that the log file contained blanks. And there are 4 different inferences that the team has at this point. And depending on which inference we pick, it's going to require a different type of fix. And if we guess at which one we think it is and just go and fix it, we're going to be potentially wasting resources fixing a problem that actually doesn't exist. So we really want to know which inference is true. Now I have to really hand it to the Wells Fargo team because they did something that I don't see very often, which is they actually thought through what the different inferences could be. Many teams just take the first one that comes up and say, well, we'll fix that. But okay, that's got to be it. Let's go work on that. And they don't bother to do this. The best designers never stop at the first inference. They keep asking, well, what else could cause this? What else could cause this? Don't confuse this, by the way, with the 5 whys, right? If you've ever heard the method of the 5 whys, which is, somebody says, well, this is what we want. You say, why? This is what we want. You basically play a 5-year-old. You just keep asking why, right? That's different than coming up with what else could cause this. What else could cause this? The 5 whys actually potentially leads us down the wrong path because we're always taking the first inference. So the team decided to conduct some usability tests. They brought some people in and actually watched them use the site, and in some cases got them to use search. And what they noticed was, in fact, there were several people amongst the participants in their study that did not realize that that box was where you were supposed to type. And so they noticed that that was what was happening. Now this was an observation. We have now a second observation to go with the first one. And because we have the second observation, all of the other inferences fall away because they don't match both observations. So now we know what to fix. we know where to put the resources. And the way that we turn inferences into observation is through research. If we do the research, we can take these things that are guesses that may or may not be right and actually confirm or disprove them and get to what we need to do. Now, I've done a little bit of research and I've collected some data about the home pages of 4 popular services. And I've mapped out here what that data looks like. And what I want you to do is guess what that data represents. What is that variable that I've mapped out here? This is about the home page of each of these services. Now I'm going to give you a hint. Okay. It's strongly correlated to their market valuation. So what could the variable be of their home page that is strongly correlated to their market valuation? Any guesses? This is the audience participation portion of today's program. What? Creating a new account? That's a good guess. It's not correct, but it's a good guess. Any other guesses?
Ads or links?
Ads or links. That's a good guess, but no, neither of those. Here, I'll save you the trouble. It's the number of times the letter E appears on all those pages. No, seriously. If we looked at what Snapchat's page looked like, you'll see there's only a couple of E's on the page. If we look at Airbnb, they have more. If we look at Uber, there's a lot more. And Facebook has E's out the wazoo. Okay? Now, here's the thing about counting the number of E's on the homepage. It's a really stupid thing to do. Okay? It's not, we all know this, right? Why would we measure this? This is not a useful thing to measure. Though I will tell you, I have given this presentation to like Silicon Valley types, and I swear there was a venture capitalist in the back of the room who got on his phone and like, we have to add more E's to the homepage. Counting the number of E's on the homepage is a stupid metric. But it's still a metric. And that's important. Now, metric is a word that we like to use, and we're not always clear on what we mean by it. So I've come up with some very strict definitions. A measure is something we can count. We can count the number of E's on the home page. We can count the number of clicks on a button. We can count the number of times someone requests our page, someone visits our page. Technically, actually, we can't count the number of times they visit the page. What we can count is the number of HTTP requests our server gets for a file that will render as the page. And that's an important distinction because people can visit our page that's cached and it won't make a request to the server. And there are other things that may not cause the server counts to be accurate. So in fact, we're not counting visits when we say visits. We're counting some guess as to what visits are likely to have been. And that's key. But we also can count how many times a user smiles during a usability test. We can count how many times they swear during a usability test. All of these are measures. A metric is a measure that we track. So we can actually say when we first started usability testing, people swore a lot more and smiled a lot less than they do in our most recent usability tests. That's a measure we're tracking. We can also track whether the number of times files are requested from the server go up or go down. Gesundheit. So we can track all of these things. An analytic when we talk about websites is a measure that software tracks. Software can track the number of times someone clicks on a button. Software can't track the number of times a user swears. Yet. Alexa can. So we're not too far from this. But just because we can count things and measure things doesn't mean we're counting and measuring the right things. This is a chart from Google Analytics showing an article that I wrote over a 2-month period with the metric time on page. Time on page theoretically shows the amount of time that is spent on the page. And notice that on December 17th, time on page is exceptionally high relative to the other dates that are shown. Any guesses why this might be? This is, again, is the audience participation portion. I was working on it. No, I write an article, I put it on the site, and I never think about it again. That's a good guess, but that wasn't what was happening. And there was somebody else who said something. It was the day we sent the email out. Yes, that's a good theory. Somehow, by sending out an email, it slows down everybody who reads the article for a day. Right? If it was visits, that would make sense. That would be a reasonable inference. But how does that affect time on page? That's the question. Right? Time on page is this weird measure. Someone back here raised their hand. Yes? Somebody opened it and then left. That could be it, that this was the day people abandoned my page to go shopping. That's as good an inference as any, because there is no reasonable inference you can ever draw from this data. Absolutely none. Right? It's all a guess, and none of it's probably right. You can't put any confidence behind the inference of why that observation of time on page happened. And by the way, just to remind you, in case you didn't know this, Google Analytics technically cannot measure time on page. Right? Google Analytics measures the time the file is requested from that browser session, and then the time the next file is requested from that browser session. And it deduces time on page out of that. So what is it actually measuring? Is it measuring the amount of time it takes someone to read the article? No, it can't do that. It just measures this gap of time that is otherwise unexplained. And that's the problem with many metrics. I might even go so far as to say all the metrics that Google Analytics reports on. That, in fact, most people don't know what they measure, and what they measure isn't what they say they measure, and there's no reasonable inferences you can draw from sudden changes in that data. Let's take another example. Let's take bounce rate. Bounce rate is the darling of search engine optimization experts. And they love bounce rate because someone looks something up on the web and they come to the page, and if they leave really quick, they're obviously not interested in the page.
Or they found exactly what they wanted.
Or they found exactly what they wanted. Exactly right. Which means two completely different things. One is good, one is bad, right? And that's the problem with this data. It can mean anything we want it to mean. We call this type of report an agenda amplifier. You come in with an agenda that you want to prove that you need to redesign the site, this data will help you with that. Look at that 89% bounce rate. We need to fix this site. People aren't finding anything useful on the site. Or, look at this website. It is perfect. People are finding what they need and they leave immediately. We don't have to touch it. Let's put our resources someplace else. Whatever your current agenda is, this one will help you. right? What it doesn't tell us is what we should do differently. We don't know really what we should do, but we do know how to tell a story based on this data. Or as the famous economist R.H. Coase once said, if you torture data long enough, it will confess to anything you'd like. Here's what Google Analytics can't tell you. Google Analytics can't tell you if what you put on the site was useful. It can't tell you if people found it confusing. If you're an e-commerce site, it can't tell you who is your biggest spender or what the big spenders do that the other people don't. It doesn't tell you how you're supposed to improve your content, and it doesn't tell you why somebody clicked. It doesn't tell you why. Right? You can't get why out of this. And that's a problem. Now, Google Analytics and the other analytics tools aren't the only problem from this. We have other problems too, which are we base these things on these goals that we think are important. Let's take something like conversion rate. Conversion rate is the darling of e-commerce sites, but it's now spread into other sites. And conversion rate is very important. Oh, I should have put this up at the beginning of the talk, but there's a warning that goes with this talk, which is there will be some mathematical content. Conversion rate is a ratio. And it's a ratio of the number of people who purchase divided by the number of people who visit. So, for example, if I have 1 million visitors to an e-commerce site, and out of those visitors, 10,000 people made a purchase, we would say that that e-commerce site's conversion rate is 1%. Now, people don't just use conversion rate now for e-commerce. They use it for people signing up for emails, right? So Luke Stevens referred to the email addresses as his conversions. People coming to pay their taxes, people coming to pay a parking ticket, all of those can be measured in terms of conversions. The number of people who take the action divided by the number of people who came theoretically to take the action. Now, the problem with conversion rate is it's a ratio. If I want to improve my conversion rate, one thing I could do is take my 1 million users and try and get twice as many of them to purchase. That would bump my conversion rate to 2% from 1%. But it's a ratio, which means I can also get the same 2% by having the same number of people purchase and just having the number of visitors. I can actually improve any e-commerce website by cutting out their marketing budget. Because when you cut out the marketing budget, only the loyal people come back to purchase. Much fewer visitors, but much higher purchase rate. Conversion goes skyrocketing. Revenues go down. Right? And I remember having this conversation with e-commerce people, and I had to spell it out with them. I had a bunch of e-commerce execs in a room like this, and they were like, I'm not getting this. And I'm like, okay, let me spell it out. I get $1 million from the first formula, and I get $2 million from the second formula, but the third one only gives me $1 million, even though it's a higher conversion rate. And it was like I was trying to explain how dinosaurs lived at the same time as McDonald's. This just did not parse for them. And I finally said, okay, I can give you a choice. Do you want a higher conversion rate, or do you want more money? And they still had to think about it. They have been so programmed that conversion rate is the most important metric they should track. That this idea that it's lying to them about what's really happening was counter to everything that they had thought in the past. And there's other problems with conversion rate. So for example, let's say I sell a complicated, expensive product. Let's say I sell insurance. Someone comes to the site 4 times, and only on the last time do they purchase. Because each time they're doing research, and then they go away, and they come back, and maybe they go talk to their superior spouse, and come back, and they finally make a purchase. And is that a conversion rate of 4 visits and 1 purchase? That would make it 25%. Or is it a conversion rate of 1 customer and 1 purchase, which would make it 100%? Do we care about actual visits in this instance, or do we care about customers? And here's the thing. Most people who calculate conversion rates don't know what their software actually is counting. So they don't know which of these they're getting. If you're going by visits, what's the highest possible conversion rate you could expect? Right? It's probably not going to be 100%. It may not even be 50%. So what is the goal to set? But the biggest problem with conversion rate is it doesn't tell you why. Conversion rate spikes just like time on page and bounce rate. We don't know why. So this isn't helping us that way either. Okay, I want to play another game here. In this one, I'm going to show you 7 words. I want you to see if you can pick out one that is different than the rest. So we have delightful, amazing, awesome, excellent, remarkable, incredible, and satisfactory. Which of these to you seems a little different than all the others? Satisfactory. And that's because satisfactory isn't that good. Satisfactory is sort of neutral. Are you satisfied? Yeah, I'm satisfied. Right? If we were talking about restaurants, the equivalent to satisfactory is edible. Huh? Hey, how was that place you ate last night? Oh, I got to tell you, that's probably the most edible place in Salt Lake City. This is not a glowing endorsement. Right? Saying that something is edible is not that exciting. And saying that something is satisfactory is not that exciting. And this is weird because we create satisfaction surveys. We ask people how satisfied they are with the things we are producing. That's an awfully low bar to be setting for ourselves. We can do much better than just going for satisfaction. And the problem is that satisfaction surveys have become so overused that they are just completely meaningless. Here's one for the online service on an airplane. And I don't know if you can read it, but there's this one here. It says, ease of connecting to the GoGo Insight SSID. I am going to bet you that most people who look at that have no idea what half of the words in that sentence mean, let alone whether they were extremely satisfied, very satisfied, neither satisfied nor dissatisfied, somewhat dissatisfied, or very dissatisfied. Right? They won't know how satisfied are you right now with that light? I can tell you I'm just somewhat satisfied with that light. What would it take for me to get very satisfied with that light? I don't know. Right? And this is part of the problem. This is because the social scientists have sort of corrupted our thinking. We take this neutral thing, neither satisfied nor dissatisfied, and we put around it the two things that we want to ask about. Are you satisfied? Are you dissatisfied? Again, being satisfied or dissatisfied, there's not a lot of distance between those, but okay, let's do that. But the social scientists will tell you that people don't like to pick extremes, so you have to create more than one choice for them. So then we add somewhat and extremely so that we can give people a choice. But if one of us is thinking that light is somewhat satisfactory and someone else thinks that light is extremely satisfactory, are we actually different in our opinions, or does someone just have a lower expectation for lights? And so that's the problem, right? Is that the scale is wrong. Now, if we really care about this data, we could just make satisfied the neutral, because it is a neutral thing. It's like edible. And then on either side we could say, well, I was delighted or frustrated. And if we want to go with the social scientists, we would put somewhat and extremely, and then when we count it up, we should combine those two scores for somewhat and extremely on each side, because we don't really know what the difference is. Right? But that's not what we do. Instead, we do things like this, where we create 10-point scales. A 10-point scale is a fantastic way to say, we don't really care what your answer is. Because what is the difference between a 6 and a 7, or a 7 and an 8? There is no real difference there. And so the problem is that 10-point scales make the noise of data seem like they're science. It's like, we went up from a 6.4 to a 7.2. We deserve raises. Okay? But what actually pushed us up? And the worst of these are things like Net Promoter Score. Net Promoter Score is this plague that has infected institutions across the planet. And I'm hoping a vaccine comes out soon. Are working on this. The thing about Net Promoter Score is it doesn't actually measure anything. The question is so convoluted. We're asking for a prediction of likelihood for a future act that doesn't make sense. I've had people tell me that they got this question after visiting the hospital because their child has been diagnosed with leukemia. How likely would you recommend our cancer clinic to your friends and colleagues? No one wants to recommend the cancer clinic to their friends and colleagues. This question makes no sense in that context. Yet everybody is using it because they believe this tells you anything, and it tells you nothing. And the big problem with all of these satisfaction and score type things is they can't tell you why. Why do the numbers change? What should you do differently as a result? So we have to start thinking about the way we measure completely differently. We have to start really sort of looking for what we need to measure. And one way to go about that is reflected in a case study that we had. We can look at the way that people interact with our services by paying attention to what it's like to actually use the service. We can create what we call a journey map. And the journey map is not a precise numerical measure. It's a relative measure that reveals where problems are. Problems that we can then go about fixing. So if we watch somebody go through a process, we can look and see, okay, So these are the steps that they went through. This is for booking a hotel online. And we're going to measure those steps based on a scale of extreme frustration to extreme delight. And as we observe the person, we're going to record how frustrated or delighted they are at every step. And we're going to map this out on a chart. And we can see that the first step was a bit delightful, but the next step turned out to be a little frustrating. It got delightful again, and then it got really frustrating. And because we're sitting there watching them, we can actually see what frustrated them and what delighted them. We can talk to them. We can ask them questions. And this map now can help us get to what we need to do differently, because all of that interaction results in observations, not inferences. Now, we can focus on the frustrating bit. And there's lots of things that people find frustrating. The content is confusing. The information's incomplete. They can't remember their password. There are features that they need that they can't find. There are navigation that they need that they can't find. There's navigation that doesn't make sense, and they click on something thinking it means something else. And there are error messages that are really confusing. And the thing about error messages is that they are a fantastic proxy for frustration. Nobody gets an error message and goes, "Wow, I am happy you told me that." Right? And so the question then becomes, what are the most common error messages you get? Is it the one that says that phone numbers can't have dashes or spaces? I don't understand why in 2019 this is even an error message. Right? Here's the thing. It takes 10 lines of code to figure out if a phone number that has been typed in has dashes or spaces and whether or not to report that back to the user. It only takes one line of code to remove any dashes and spaces someone types into a phone number. Why are we telling them to type it in again? I know we don't store it that way, but that's just showing our underwear. Right? The user shouldn't know this. Or that the security code, what's known in the industry as the CVV, is the card verification V. I don't know what it is. That it, that field was left empty. You know why that field was left empty? Because following security procedure, we're not allowed to retain that information. So if we discover that your phone number has dashes or spaces in it, we redraw the form, we have to erase that field. And therefore you have to type it again. But we didn't tell you you had to type it again. We only told you you had to take the spaces and the dashes. So now we get that error message. Okay. Or the most popular one, I'm going to bet, on your website is username and password does not match. And we won't tell you which, because bad guys could figure out how to break into our traffic ticket payment system and pay all the tickets, and nobody would know if we told you whether it was your username or your password that caused the error in the first place. Right? That's the problem. And here's the thing. Do you know what the most popular error message is in your systems? Because if you did, you could start there to look for what to do differently. Right? The thing about all the analytics packages is that they're fully customizable. You can add a couple lines of code and count anything you want. So why don't we start counting things that actually matter to us? Things that could actually point to the right problems. So years ago we had a client, major e-commerce company. At the time, they were doing about $1.2 billion of e-commerce a year. So this was fairly significant size for a company at that time. And they were very concerned that they were losing people in checkout. And they tried a whole bunch of things. Their team had worked really hard. Nothing seemed to fix the problem. So they contacted us. And the first thing we did was we said, okay, what does checkout look like? Well, it turns out they have a 4-step checkout process followed by done. Right? You put in your shipping information, you put in your billing information, the address, and then you put in the payment information, the card number, and then you say, yep, I want to make this purchase, and then you're done. And we said, how do you know that you're losing people in this process? And they said, well, we looked at our analytics, and our analytics said that people are dropping off. Now, it wasn't a huge drop-off, but when you do a million visitors a day and $1.2 billion a year, that could be a big chunk of money. So if we could recover much of that, if not all of it, that would be worth it to them. And that's where they were focused. We said, okay, we will help you with this, but to do that, we want to watch people shop. And they said, oh, that's cool, we've never done that before. So all the things they tried to fix it didn't involve actually watching shoppers shop. We're like, okay, we'll show you how to do it. You can do it alongside us. That would be awesome. That's great. Okay, so here's something we've learned about e-commerce sites. You can't ask people to pretend to shop. People who pretend to shop behave very differently than people who are actually shopping. People who pretend to shop will just zoom through the process. They won't pay attention to the product you've asked them to bring. Pretend you need a laptop. Go buy one, right? Yeah, fine. Click, I found a laptop, I bought it. Right? It takes them almost no time to do that. But if you found people who were in the market to buy their next laptop, and you said, okay, we want to watch you shop for that, they're very picky about the laptop they buy. So we said we need to watch people who are shopping for things. So we're going to recruit from your customer base people who are ready to shop and incentivize them to come in and let us watch them buy it in front of us. Okay, that sounds really cool. We want to do that. I said the other thing we would like is we'd like to get some baseline measures of what happens before this so we can just compare the traffic and see what we're doing. And we figured that what we would see is that it would be about even, that the number of people who are hitting this first page or the number of people who hit the previous page, and we wouldn't see much drop-off there, because if there was drop-off, we'd be talking about that. So they went and they got us that data, and when they got the data, oh my God, there was a drop-off. There was a huge drop-off. And we're looking at this, they hand it to us, and they're like, okay, what else? And I'm like, do you notice this? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, okay, so this is big. This is bigger. They're like, yeah. So shouldn't we be looking at this? Oh, no. That's shopping cart attrition. Shopping cart attrition. Shopping cart attrition is something that e-commerce people live with. It's this idea that people put things in their shopping cart, but they decide not to purchase, and they abandon their shopping cart. I've never understood why e-commerce people think this is just a natural thing, because it doesn't happen in real life, right? If it happened in real life, we would be in Costco. And the closer we got to the checkout, the more abandoned shopping carts filled with stuff we would be passing, as if the rapture had come, and only the sinners were left to purchase. And that doesn't happen. Yeah, occasionally someone has to run out and leave their cart, but not at the rate that e-commerce people see abandoned shopping carts. And I was about to explain this to them when somebody said, anyways, we have a plan to fix it. I go, oh, really? They go, yeah. We're going to let the marketing people do it. Now I'm really interested. I said, really? How are the marketing people going to fix it? Oh, they're just going to keep emailing people until they come back and buy what's in their shopping cart. Like, you be you. You go do that. That sounds good. We'll focus on the problem you've hired us for. That sounds great. So, our first participant in our usability test comes in. And we watch them shop around. They put a bunch of stuff in their cart. They then come here and they see the review cart page and are like, yep, this is exactly what I want to buy. And we're expecting them to go straight to the shipping information page, but they don't. Instead, there's a page where they have to log into their account. And then, because this person can't remember their password, and it's telling them that could be their username, so they try other usernames. They eventually give up, and they hit request password reset. And there they type in what they think their username is, but they're not sure. And they go and they sit and wait for an email. And then when they get to the email, they come back and they have to put in a new password, because once you ask to reset it, you actually have to reset it. And then they get to go to shipping information. And we turn to our contact at the company and we say, can we see the data for these pages in here? And they're like, absolutely. And our contact gets up and leaves the room and comes back 30 minutes later and says, absolutely not. We say, why not? They say, so these pages here, they are owned by the people in the security department. And the security department, these people, well, they wear tinfoil hats. They are always worried about bad guys and their brainwaves being read by aliens. And they tend to be very paranoid about everything. And they will not insert the analytics code onto those pages, because that could be a security vulnerability. So they are refusing to collect the data. And so we've actually never collected any of this data. And that's why it didn't show up in the original reports. Like, okay. And in the meantime, I am keeping my primary contact, the person who hired us, who happened to be the CEO of the company, I'm keeping him up to date on our progress. And so I pop him off a little email just saying, so you know, the security people are telling us that we can't get the analytics for these 5 pages. It'd be really helpful if we had them, but we can make do without them. And I get a message back in under 10 minutes, obviously from a BlackBerry, that just says, please hold. And then I get another message back about 5 minutes later saying, fixed. And sure enough, the security people have changed their mind on this position and are right now, as we speak, instrumenting these pages so that we can get some counts. But we have to wait a few weeks to see the data. Okay. But we make a guess that maybe the data looks a little like that. That could be what's there. And the data finally comes in, and it doesn't look anything like that. It turns out that it's really weird. Our baseline data is only a third of the number of people who visit that page, which does not make any sense to us, because that page is the only way you can get there is from the review shopping cart page. You can only get to the login page from one place. So at most it could be 100%. You click on the button, you're there. How's it 3 times as much? And then we noticed this huge drop-off to the request password reset. A lot of people just disappear and don't reset their password and don't get any farther. And then we see a smaller drop-off for the people who are going to their email and trying to reset. And then some tiny drop-offs relatively for people who are resetting their password and then getting to the shipping information. So we have this puzzle to solve. And it isn't until we're a couple usability tests into our sequence that we realize what is actually happening. And that what is happening here is that the reason there's a spike is because this is counting the number of times the page is requested. And the page is requested every single time someone makes an error in their username and password. So the fact that it's 3 times higher means people are trying 3 times on average to get their username and password. And then that's why a large number drops, because you only ask once to reset it. And then you go wait for an email that you may or may never get. So we asked another question. And the other question was, based on that big drop-off, how does that impact the e-commerce company? And the way we asked it was this: how much money is in the shopping carts of the people who can't log in and abandon their cart? And it turns out it wasn't a huge amount of money. It was $300 million. $300 million on a $1.2 billion company. So basically, it was a fifth of the overall potential revenue they could be making, they were losing because people couldn't log into their existing account. And they were losing them in the process. The company then decided to implement something they called guest checkout. This was something that had been designed years before, but never implemented because it was just not a high priority. And there were a bunch of political reasons why they didn't want to do it. But now those political reasons had gone away. For some reason, $300 million can solve a lot of political arguments. And suddenly, this was a priority. And they got it implemented, and within a few weeks, I got a phone call from the CEO. I still have it. It's the only voicemail I've ever saved on my voicemail system. It says, "Spool man, you are amazing," because I found his $300 million. Turns out they ended up recovering that in the first year. That was the problem. Now that $300 million came from both doing what we would call qualitative user research, doing usability tests, and quantitative custom metrics. Right? And these were custom metrics. These weren't the metrics that comes out of the box with the analytics tool. This was something we created. If we were to name it, we would call it unrealized shopping cart value from password issues. This is the only time we ever wanted that metric because it proved its point. Once we solved the problem, that number reduced dramatically and we don't have to track it anymore. Qualitative findings drove our quantitative research. So that's how we want to look at this. We want to do qualitative stuff first. We want to go into the lab, watch people, and then ask the question, how many times does that happen to other people? If we see people, when they're paying their tax bill, making a particular mistake, and we see it 2 or 3 times, we can ask the question, how often does that problem happen? We can create some way to instrument that, and we can actually start counting and say, wow, this happens a lot. Or no, those were the only 3 people in the world who this ever happens to. And knowing the difference between those 2 things will change what we do next. And because we watch people do it, we probably have a good idea of why. And this allows us to have an argument to go to our leadership to say, look, this is a problem that we could benefit from if we fixed. So this gives us power. Now, I just want to remind us that the team had a bunch of inferences that turned out not to be true. The checkout steps weren't where we found the biggest improvement. It was not normal to lose customers before checkout. Cart review didn't go straight to checkout, and all the screens weren't instrumented. The inferences they had were completely different. But it was in the usability testing process that we found this. But here's the even bigger thing. We saw the problem in the very first participant. Now that's rare, it doesn't happen that way every time, but it did happen for us. And when we looked at the journey map for that participant, we completely saw frustration where that problem was. So by starting with user research, by starting with usability testing and other types of user research, we see amazing things that we can make improvements in the service and products that we're delivering to our constituents. And we start with, by focusing our quantitative research on where people are frustrated with what we're delivering today. Observations trump inferences. I would like to get that verb back, by the way. I feel like it's been hired or stolen from us. When I talk about this, people often start coming up to me with reasons why they can't do it. Those reasons are no longer acceptable, right? One of the reasons is, well, we've got a group of people who monitor this, or in some cases, we don't have anybody who monitors this, right? We need to do that. Well, if you have a dedicated UX team, or if you are the dedicated UX team, right, this is your job now, right? We have to say, okay, this belongs to us. And just in case you're like, well, that's what companies can do, we can't do this in government. This is DJ Patel. DJ Patel was President Obama's data scientist. The first, as far as I know, the only data scientist that we've ever had in the White House. If the president can have one, you can have one too. And I would highly recommend you look at it. But the other thing that people tell us is that they just don't understand the metrics. They don't understand what these things are trying to tell you. And here's the thing that I've learned about online analytics tools. If you don't actually know what it's telling you, it's not telling you anything. Right? The reality is that the most effective metrics are metrics that everybody understands, how they're derived, what they're telling us, and what the implications are. And so we have to keep them simple. There was not a lot of complication here. It was money left in shopping carts. Everybody understood what that meant. And the other thing is people are like, "What? I'm just not a numbers person." People don't go into design because they're really good with numbers. We got that. But here's the thing. The numbers that we're talking about don't have to have crazy formulas behind them. The mathematical function we used to calculate the size of all the shopping carts was plus. Right? We just added them up. That was the most sophisticated we got. Figuring out what the value of a given shopping cart for a user who couldn't enter their password, that was a tricky piece of programming. But adding all the numbers up once we got them, that was not the hard part. So we can collect this data, we can make it work. Okay. We define design as the rendering of intent. A designer has an intention in the world, and the way the designer renders it, right? We have a change we want to see in the world. We want people to be able to interact with government more effectively than before. How we design for that is how we render it. If you follow some of the NASA astronauts who are in the space station, one of the things you'll notice is they tweet a lot of pictures. And when you're looking at Twitter, you can see their pictures, and their pictures are fantastic. And you can watch them and you can see what's going on. If you follow a guy named Mike Montero, he's a friend of mine, he tweets a lot of things too, and he tweets pictures also. But for some reason, his pictures don't show up. It's because he's using Instagram, not Twitter. And Twitter decided, or actually Twitter didn't decide, Facebook decided when they acquired Instagram, that they were not going to show Instagram pictures on Twitter. That was a decision that the Facebook people, the Instagram people, decided to do when they were acquired. Whereas Twitter lets you see the pictures, Instagram makes you click. And if you see a link from Mike with a picture, you should always click. It's always worth it. Now the thing is that the reason they do this is because of monthly active users. Monthly active users is a metric that these companies track that measure how many people are active on the website. And because you can't see whether someone's looking at a picture when they're on Twitter, they can't measure that. But they can measure the click that comes from it. So they artificially make the interface less usable in order to get you to put the data into their system so they can report that you were an active user by clicking on that picture. And we see lots of sites doing this. LinkedIn will no longer show you the messages that people send you. You have to click through to see them. Facebook no longer shows you the messages that people show you, right? And the reason that they're doing this is not because there's some security thing. It's because they want to show that people are using their site, and they can't tell if you're reading their email or not. They can't measure that as effectively as having a click to measure. Robert Fabricant, who's a design director at Frog, said that the medium of design is behavior. What we are trying to do is change people's behaviors. And we have to make sure that what we measure does that. If you post an article on Medium, they give you all sorts of statistics. One of the statistics they give you is views, but another statistic they give you is reads. And reads is the number of people who actually read the thing, which was the reason you posted it on Medium in the first place. Now, again, technically they can't tell if you read it. They can only tell that you slowly scrolled to the bottom. But maybe that's a good proxy. Time will tell. The design that we create must drive the way we collect metrics, not the other way around. We cannot let the metrics drive the design. That's an important rule. So that's what I came to talk to you about. That we need to have metrics that help us improve the experience, not just report us things that we report back and can use for any agenda we want. We need to make sure we don't jump from observation to inference too soon, that we're always testing what we're trying to do. We need to make sure that we customize the metrics to match the experience objectives, and finally, we have to realize that the skills of data science are skills of design. We have to incorporate them for us. So that's what I came to talk to you about. We have launched a new newsletter. If you found any of this interesting, we have a newsletter on all aspects of strategy for UX, not just measuring our success. It's free. It comes in your email. Every week you get an email message. We don't give your email address to anybody else or sell it to anybody else. It will only be used for this purpose. In fact, if you are already on one of our other lists, we will not automatically add you to this one. So you have to go and do that because we don't automatically assume you want this. So you'll need to sign up for that if you want it. And if you're really into strategy, we have workshops that we regularly give in our Chattanooga office and other places around the world where we talk about strategy. And we've had many government groups come through this workshop. It's something that be happy to have you do. If you want to look into this more, you can go to playbook.uie.com. It will tell you more. And finally, there are articles, a whole bunch of articles about measurement, about design on our website. You can reach me at jspool@uie.com. If you're working in design and we're not connected on LinkedIn, that's also a great way. Connect to me on LinkedIn. I find that to be an effective way to keep up with folks. And finally, you can follow me on the Twitters where I tweet about design, design process, design strategy, and the amazing customer service habits of the airline industry. And that's what I came to talk to you about. Thank you very much. Do we have time for questions? Yes? We have time. Okay, as if you haven't suffered enough. We have time for a question or two. Yes, we have a question over here.
Again, so I can see where I'm going.
There you go. I guess we're using the microphone for the home audience, right?
Yes.
I'm a little nervous about asking this question because I'm not super experienced with this, but one question that I had when you were talking about like the last example with the your friend who you couldn't see the picture and all of that stuff, a lot of website accessibility experts talk about with accessibility information, the on-click, and what would you say about, they want you to actually have to do something and that's better for accessibility for people who are, not able, so that when things happen without having a click. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that the latest version of the WCAG and a lot of the new browser implementations allow us to not force the user to click in order to get alt tag information or class information from the ARIA roles or things of that sort. And so I think with smart design, you would you could get past this. But I am not the authority for a specific question like that. But I do know people who would be really good at answering it. So if you were to pop me a message, I would rope them into answering that question and be very happy to get an answer to it. But my understanding is that that's about 10-year-old thinking where the browsers were about 10 years ago and where the browsers are today. Now, granted, not everyone's using an up-to-date browser. So there is that constraint, but where the browsers are today, I think we can avoid a lot of that game playing that we used to have to do in the name of accessibility, and that the browsers are way more accessible for things that are just sort of the innate behaviors that designers want the users to have. But for that specific question, I would go to one of about 6 other people who I know who are geniuses at CSS and accessibility and would be able to answer that question right away. But, yeah.
So I just wanted to ask a question about that Medium example. I'm not familiar with that site, but
The view versus read on Medium.
Yeah. So for the read measure, I don't know if all their pages are so long that you have to scroll down to the bottom, but are there?
So Medium is a site. If you read articles on the web these days, you've been to Medium. You just may not know it, because a lot of times they have custom URLs. But it's a site for long form content. So it has articles that are usually 500 to 2,000 or 3,000 words, and so it's not a single screen of information. It's really designed for someone's in-depth thinking on something.
And what is your thoughts on scrolling down or pagination versus pagination?
Oh, scrolling.
Yeah, for sure.
Breaking things up for pagination is another one of these tricks that people use to up their numbers. Primarily if they're advertiser paid, you'll see this a lot, because every time you page, you could throw up a new set of ads. But people complained about that, so the publishers relented. And they said, okay, we won't do that anymore. Instead, what we're going to do is when you scroll, we're going to insert an ad in the middle of your stuff, whether you want it or not. So you'll be reading, and of course it has to go and fetch the ad and bring it back. So there's a latency issue. So what happens is you start reading this article and suddenly your paragraph goes away, and now you're looking at an ad for some sort of Viagra competitor, and it's like, you're now wondering if the conditions last more than 4 hours, and that's not at all what you were supposed to be thinking about when they brought you to the article. And so that's the problem. No.
Keep your hand up while I make my way over there.
Okay. I hope you're wearing your Fitbit.
I am.
She is.
Good. This is how you get your
should have
steps
seen her
in.
yesterday. She was trucking. So in regard to the Instagram photos, do you know if they're starting now to track, like you were talking about with the drop-off before in the login, do you know if they're tracking if people have stopped going to those sites? Because I got rid of my Facebook page, which therefore meant I got rid of Instagram too, really. I just abandoned all of it. So anytime I see on Twitter an Instagram link, I'm like, I'm not going to look at any of your content anymore.
Right.
So I'm wondering, do you know
they
if...
pay attention to all of that.
Yeah, I was just wondering...
But because that number... See, here's the thing about sites that are free.
Right.
Is they have to prove that they're more valuable than other sites that are free, and they use that metric. That's the standard metric instead of money. Right? Somebody who charges money, you can just say, well, how much money did they make? Turns out that's a really useful metric to track. But when you don't charge money for your stuff, you end up tracking, you have to track something that shows that, well, we are more valuable to our users than somebody else. And that monthly average user has become the industry standard, even though it is a completely gamed number. And there's no way to audit it. There's no way to ensure that it's real. But it's what people use for advertising rates. It's what people use for corporate valuations. I mean, billions of dollars are tied to that one metric that has no capability of being audited.
Well, I think about that with government. Like, we're not charging for a lot of things unless you have to pay your property taxes, pay a parking ticket, and just think about, the CIO or other directors wanting this data that a lot of times has no meaning at all.
Right. So that's a very important point. So what she said was that in government, you're not there to make a profit. currently at the local and state level. At the federal level, it seems to be changing. There's a lovely golf course in Scotland. Remember the vets. So, but we need metrics to go to the leadership, you know, who are trying to decide whether they fund our operation or they fund some other essential operation. And it makes sense, right? Do I build a website? Do I fix potholes? I mean, in some places, that is the literal decision. So we need to show the value. And so the way that we're approaching this with government and other agencies, and we do this with nonprofits and other folks, is that we focus on outcomes. Right? And the outcomes that we focus on are things like, if we did a fantastic job, whose life are we making better? So let's take being able to pay parking tickets online. You know, theoretically simple thing that turns out to have lots of complications and really hard to do well, but let's take that service. Okay? So whose life do we make better if we do a fantastic job of being able to do parking tickets online? Whose life do we make better? Well, we certainly make the person who owes the money's life a little easier, because they don't have to write a check, they don't have to come into the clerk's office, they can just do this in person, or they can do this online, they can deal with it. The town gets money faster if we give them this capability. Hell, if we let them set up an account and store their credit card, we can just pull it, you know, every time. Go ahead, violate our parking rules. We'll just make money off you. So you get the money a little faster that way. Fine. And you're reducing the amount of things the clerk has to deal with, because checking somebody's parking fines off is going a bit faster. And chances are you're going to have less things escalate into having to deal with the sheriff or however process you collect uncollected parking tickets, right? So all of those things are improved. So now, can we build metrics around each of those things and measure those things? Now, some of them could be analytics. Some of them we may just have to count. Like, how much time does the clerk spend at the desk collecting parking tickets? What is the average time of a parking ticket? How many tickets do they collect every month? Does that number go down? Can we say, well, we freed up this much time from the clerk so they can go do all the other things that we've thrust onto the clerk's office because they're always overworked? And we can do the same thing all the way through. We can measure how quickly we get paid. We can measure the number of constituents who are paying their parking tickets this way. We can see all the different numbers. But we have to start with the outcome. If we start with the outcome and we work backwards, we will get to meaningful metrics that will translate into something everybody can understand. So in Massachusetts, we have town meeting. So at town meeting, the whole town comes together. I wish it was the whole town. It's a portion of the town that comes together, and we vote, and all of the town officials are up in the front of the room. And they are constantly reporting these outcomes to us. This is what this new program did. And it makes a difference. The big controversy we have now is, in the middle of town, we have this railroad bridge that is 11 feet 6 inches high, and we just paid $1 million for a new fire truck that is 11 feet 8 inches tall. No. Though we specified it to be 11 feet 4 inches tall, and so somehow we got a $1 million fire truck that is just too big. Man, that has been the news for 6 weeks. I love our town. Is that it? Or no, we have one? Okay, yes.
Hi.
Hi.
About those delightful surveys where you put how satisfied you are from 1 to 10 and all that, what advice do you have about things that we could say to supervisors or higher ups who really like that kind of measurement?
I would see if you can get added to the survey, if it's not already there, a question that says why. Why did you give us that number? And see if that generates anything useful. But the best thing, so I gave this talk to a bunch of software CEOs a few months ago. And then there was this speaker thing. And one of the other speakers was a CEO of a software company. And he sits down to me at the speaker event. And he says, I want to talk to you about your talk. I'm like, okay. He says, you got the NPS thing all wrong. I said, oh, okay. He says, it's like been the most useful thing I've ever used in my business. I'm like, okay, tell me how it's been useful to you. He says, well, we send it to all our customers, and they give us our scores back every month. And then I've got a team of people who, every time someone gives me a score of 6 or less, which in NPS world is called a detractor, a 6 or less, we call them up. And we talk to them, and the information we get has been so useful that we've made major improvements to our product, and we are because of that, our sales have steadily increased. The NPS thing is at the core of it, and it's been fantastic. I said, that's great. I said, you should keep doing that. I said, if you want to save some time, ignore the number. Just call people up. Ask them what's working and what isn't. He says, well, how would I know who to call? Like, well, how do you know who to call now? Well, I call everybody who's a 6 or less. I said, are you assuming that everybody who's a 7 or more does not need to be talked to? You're missing all sorts of really valuable things potentially about what you're doing right that you should not break. He's like, but I can't call everyone. I said, okay, then just call a random group. I wouldn't know who to call. Like, literally, there's a random number generator in Excel. Call everybody, assign them a number. Here's what you do. Take all your customers, assign them a number between 0 and 10, and everybody who comes up with a 6 or less, call them. It's the same thing. It's like, you don't understand it. He got up and he left. But that's it, right? Here's what you do. You say, you know what? We need to find out why. So we're going to start calling all the people who said they're dissatisfied, and we're going to ask them why. And we're going to call a handful of people who said they're really satisfied, and we're going to ask them why. And then we're going to take that information and we're going to surface it to everybody and see what patterns emerge. And when you do that, ignore the numbers. Don't tell anybody what this number was. Tell them what you learned from those patterns. And if you do all that, you will learn so much, and it will be so beneficial. And the numbers, if putting the numbers there make your supervisor happy, you know, it's like the door close button on an elevator. Or the door open button, right? It doesn't actually do anything. The door is going to do what it's going to do. You know, but it feels like you've done that. Go with it. I'm okay with that. I will sleep well tonight giving you that advice.
Hi. Yeah, one question I have for you is that the different web teams represented here like range quite a bit in size, and some of them are even like these like valiant web teams of one. So for teams that are resource constrained and would love to have like a UX person on the team, but really don't have much experience with usability testing and don't have the resource allocation for it, how do you get started? Where, like, are there like guerrilla usability testing that you can recommend to people? Like, how do you go down that path when you're resource constrained?
Absolutely. In fact, the work that a bunch of us have been doing in government is just going around and teaching CIOs and developers and other people inside of government stuff to do really sort of basic, poorly executed usability tests. because a poorly executed usability test means that you're spending time with an actual person. And that's what actually matters. And so I think the best story came that I've heard from this came from Sid Harrell, who at the time was at Code for America, and she was teaching basic usability testing to any government official who would listen. And she got the CIO of Asheville, North Carolina, to come. And he'd never heard of this before. And he had this project in his head that they were going to create this giant database of all of the city's data so that anybody could go and look up any fact about anything that the city knew about. And he was starting with all the properties in the city of Asheville. And so you could type an address into this thing and it would tell you everything about that thing, you know, what the value of the land was, what the sewer conditions were, when trash pickup was, how much violence is in that neighborhood, where the nearest fire hydrant is. All of that stuff was in this database. But it had a really horrible experience. And he just thought that this idea of usability testing was cool. So he started by doing she gave him a half-day workshop on this. That's all the time that they had to learn how to do it. He immediately went back with his team, and they started by just getting people from the cubes next door to their cubes to start testing it. And it turns out those were the marketing communications people. So they were fine. So he had them do things, and they made changes and tried again. And then he went down to the clerk's office, and anybody who walked in the clerk's office, hey, can I have 10 minutes of your time? I want you to try this out. Can you just put your address in and we'll see what happens? And he just did that. And it came up with something, it's called Simplicity, S-I-M-P-L-I, capital C-I-T-Y. And if you go to, I think it's Simplicity, if you just Google Simplicity Asheville, North Carolina, you will get the app. And it's fantastic. It's really easy to use. You type in any address, it tells you all the things. And he after that one half day with Sid, he was like, yeah, every project we do is going to be this way. And they didn't have any dedicated UX people. So the thing about this is that anybody can do it, right? We all learned how to do it. We weren't born with this. Any one of us can do it. So you can do it too, and they can do it. And the more people we get to do this, the better off it is. And it's not just for websites, right? If they're handing out paper forms at the school, we can get them to test the forms so that people are less likely to make mistakes when they fill the form out, right? All of the things. I agree. The emotion coming from that crowd is palpable. They're behind this idea 100%. So that's it, right? That's the basics of it. So I think these are not hard skills to master. I think anyone can do it. And as soon as we do that, all the designs get better. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for encouraging my behavior.
All right, everybody, general sessions start back up at 10:45.